In the summer of 1981, archaeologists were digging at the ruins of St Bees Priory in Cumbria. At first, it was just another dig, but when they opened a coffin sealed in lead, they found something completely unexpected.
In 1981, archaeologists digging beneath St Bees Priory in Cumbria opened what they thought was just another medieval coffin. But when the lid came off, time seemed to stop. Inside was a man who looked like he had just died. His skin, hair, and even innards were still in good shape after 600 years.
As they worked their way through the stones, the archaeologists came upon a large coffin that instantly stood out. Unlike the simple wooden boxes,
What did he do? How did his body stay alive? What secret was locked up under the lid? Keep watching to find out. The altar side secret. Start with where it is. The Benedictine house, St Bees Priory, is on the windy coast of Cumbria. It was once the link between prayer and power across the borders. The church floor is built up like a time cake. Stones on stones. Names are becoming less clear. The chancel, on the other hand, is not the same as the room by the high altar. It was the most sought-after land in the Middle Ages. It meant more grace to be near the altar. This was the end of your story if you were rich, powerful, or tied to the priory. Archaeologists carefully opened that area like a book. They made a map of slabs. They wrote down every little change in the ground. Most of the graves were what you'd expect after hundreds of years. Graves were made of plain dirt. Simple boxes made of wood are no longer made. Bones and dirt. The team then put on weight. Not the reaction of rock, but a heavy box made by people who wouldn't give. Lead instead of wood. The edges are pressed and the seams are closed tightly. It was made to keep people and things outside. Lead wasn't something that was used every day. In the 14th century, it had to be dug, smelted, moved by cart and boat, and then cut into sheets that were strong enough to hold their shape. It costs cash. There had to be links. Someone had to be able to order it, make it, and bring it to the church. A lead coffin in the aisle did not whisper who was buried there. It yelled it. The priory and the area cared about whoever was inside. That kind of family lived in Cumbria. And so did Westmoreland. Names are carved into the towers, gates with crests. Prayer and patronage are linked together. The team could read the signs before anyone opened the lid. A chancellor's job comes with special rights. A lead coffin means money and power. This man was almost certainly very important. A high priest with followers. A rich man in the area who owns land and titles. Like a knight, whose family paid to be close to the altar and get a shell that shut like a vault. The plan for work stayed simple. Write down the situation. Get ready for bones. Body parts don't keep soft tissue for hundreds of years unless they are buried in bogs or caves. They don't hold skin. Parts of them are not kept. They come back down to earth. Still, the way the box was built made people wonder. If you didn't want to be in charge of what happened next, why use lead? Why spend money on a barrier that keeps air out and water in? You shouldn't have put the grave in the most holy part of the church unless you wanted every service to walk over it like it was planned. Not just a habit. A family made sure that the dead stayed where people could remember them best. An area that made sure the living would never forget. They moved more slowly because that much weight needs extra care. Around the edges, they cleaned up. They went along the long axis. They looked at the seal. They wrote down every layer, every tool mark, and every piece of linen that stuck to the edges. The box didn't look or feel rushed or cheap in any way. It was weighed. The job was done. It was meant to last. That's the point. A grave with lead is a message. Says the person inside wasn't like other people. And the funeral shouldn't be like other funerals either. It says that time will try to get in, but we will fight it. In St Bees Priory, under stones that heard centuries of hymns, this message waited. The chancel told you who was allowed to rest there. The metal told you how far the living were willing to go to guard that rest. Then the seal broke and the lid came off. All the signs of decay stopped working. Skin, hair, and even nails were still there. We are now seeing a body that shouldn't be there. A body that shouldn't exist. With a dull mechanical sigh that lasts longer than it should in a quiet church, the lid came off. No one spoke for a second. There were no dry bones or pieces of fabric inside the box. Instead, there was the shape of a man, whole, solid, and unsettlingly human. While 600 years had passed, it looked like he had only died a few weeks before. His arms and legs were still wrapped in skin, though it was shrunken and yellowed. There were still a few thin red beard hairs stuck to his skin across his mouth. The hair on his head was flattened, but it wasn't gone. At the ends of his fingers and toes, his nails were nicely curled and ridged, like someone who might still need to get their nails trimmed. It was even stranger that the body wasn't hollow on the inside. Organs had survived under the ribs. The lungs, liver, and even the stomach could still be seen. There was no way that scientists who were trained to study dry bones could have seen this coming. Bones can tell you your age, your size, and if you're lucky, the reason you died. But flesh means story. Flesh means that the body can still talk. Every day, work stopped for the team. Everything moved more slowly. Surgery gloves were used instead of brushes. Archaeology turned into forensics. The box was moved in a controlled way, and the things inside were handled like evidence at a modern crime scene. They wrote down every little thing, like every thread of cloth that was still attached and every rusty flake that covered the inside of the lead walls. They wrote down pieces of cloth that had been used to wrap the body in a simple, plain shroud. There isn't anything fancy or dangerous. The fancy thing in this case was the box itself. Putting it near the altar made the rank clearer than any decoration could. No matter who this man was, he didn't need gold to show how important he was. His surroundings did that for him. The scene looked even weirder because of the skin's color and feel. It wasn't dry as dust or bone covered in powder. It had become a little harder, like paper. But it could still bend where it joined muscle. His limbs bent without breaking. He was buried for hundreds of years, and his tissues still wouldn't give up. Scientists took measurements, took pictures, and made lists of everything, even though they knew they were looking at something that was almost impossible. Air had been caught inside the coffin since the 13th century. It was such a tight space that decay had almost no chance of happening. The same air that had been so still for hundreds of years now came into the room. There was no finding here. There was a confrontation with time. It was clear right away what it meant. With a body that is well kept, researchers could do a lot more than just guess. They could check to see what he ate most recently, what diseases he had, and how his body healed after being hurt. They could figure out when he died, not only from his bones, but also from tissues that had recorded his pain, what he ate, and maybe even his death. It was hard to tell the difference between the present and the past at that time. Being in front of him was like being in front of history that wasn't quite done falling apart yet. A man from the 14th century sleeping in his skin is now being pulled into the light of electric lamps. It wasn't a mummy, and it hadn't been sealed with magic or embalmed by monks. It was nature and chemistry acting together in a strange way with medieval craftsmanship. Scientists knew they were seeing something that the Earth had tried to keep secret for as long as the coffin was open. They didn't just find bones. They also found the body of a person who had lived, fought, and died in the Middle Ages, and had been waiting hundreds of years to tell what really happened. That body would soon speak. Because once the shock wore off and the tests began, the story of this man's last moments, his injuries, his death, and the fact that he could not be saved would be revealed like history's confession. But to figure out what his body was trying to say, they had to look past the shock and the skin to see the cuts that killed him. The last minutes. The investigation started more like a modern investigation than an archaeological dig. As if the man had died yesterday, every move and thought was planned out and written down. Before making a single cut, the team used X-rays, scans, and photos to get a picture of everything from every angle. It wasn't about being interested. It was about being in charge. As soon as the lead box was opened, time began to run out again. Every minute spent outside was a minute that the centuries-old preserve could start to break down. The chest was the first thing that everyone noticed. It didn't sink in like a skeleton that has been crushed. Instead, it swelled up a little and stayed that way. There was a hint of pressure from the inside, the kind that happens when blood and air fill a body space. Scientists who study crime scenes knew what that meant. Inside, something had broken. The truth became clear when the autopsy started. On one side of his chest, several ribs were broken in clean, sharp turns inward. The bones broke because of force, not because they were breaking down. It was clear what kind of stress it was, the kind that happens quickly and hard while the heart is still beating. They found the damage from the blow inside the rib cage. In medical words, it was a hemothorax, which means there was a lot of bleeding inside the chest. Even now, that one wound is enough to kill anyone. His lungs would have failed almost right away, suffocating him from the inside out. The sudden pressure would have made his heart work hard until it gave out. At that moment, the body was frozen, with all of its parts still in place, its lungs compressed, and its ribs locked where they had broken. The proof of his death had been kept secret for hundreds of years, just waiting for this one study. It wasn't just the chest that was looked at. People could still tell what his liver, stomach, and even parts of his intestines were. Scientists could see pieces of what had been in his stomach that pointed to a last meal, probably eaten hours before he died. There was nothing fancy or out of the ordinary, just simple, hearty food like meat, bread, and maybe ale. From what it said, it seemed like the man had a normal life until he met an unusual end. The police didn't make any wild guesses about the guns. There was no need for them. The wounds were loud and clear. That kind of crushing blow could come from a club, a hammer, or the blunt shaft of a polearm. But the weapon itself wasn't important. What was important were the speed, direction, and force readings from the body. The impact came from the left and went downhill, as shown by the ribs. It looked like a wound from the war, not an accident. Pathology in the modern world brought those last few seconds to life. He would have been out of breath from a blow strong enough to break his ribs. Before he even hit the ground, all the air would have left his lungs. The hole would have been filled with blood, quickly suffocating the breath. The death was quick and brutal. The way his body reacted, the swelling and pools of blood, made that story very clear and scary. Bones could not have shown this on their own. If you take away the soft tissue, you can't see when the accident happened or how the person died. The clues were in the organs and chest cavity in this case. The liver and lungs were swollen, which showed that blood flow had continued for a few heartbeats after the blow. In other words, he didn't die right away. He slowly died of suffocation. He was awake long enough to feel the armor's weight, his lungs being crushed, and the air pulling away from him. The wound told the truth about his last moments, even though it didn't have a name or armor on it. He died not from illness or slow decay, but from being hit. Quick, exact, and cruel. And at that very moment, 600 years fell apart. The researchers were no longer looking at a story. They were looking at proof that a real man had died. The name behind the face. There were no clues written on the coffin or spoken in the papers that would help find out who he was. Everything around him had them built in. The church, the work, and the quiet comfort of where he lay. In England in the Middle Ages, place was language. And this grave spoke out loud. For many generations, the Lucy family had ruled these territories. They were a strong baronial dynasty that covered both Cumberland and Westmoreland. 3 interlocking pikes were their well-known symbol. You could find it on church stones, seals, and even everyday items. They were more than just fighters. They supported the church, looked out for the priory, and owned huge estates that stretched from Cockermouth Castle to the land near St Bees on the coast. When the nuns prayed in the priory, they probably thought of the Lucy family when they did so. Archaeologists quickly put the pieces together. The fancy lead coffin, the chancel position, and the wide range of dates from artifacts and soil samples all led to the 14th century. The rest was made up of historical papers.
The discovery of St Bees Man became known among academics, but in an era before today's mass media, it hardly made the news outside the local area.
During that time, only one high-ranking Lucy man died abroad and was brought back to be buried. Anthony lived in a dangerous time. As a marcher lord, his job was to keep the Scots from coming into England's northern border. He trained men for battle, kept order on his lands, and fought whenever the crown told him to under King Edward III. He wanted to do more than just make Britain his home country. He joined the Teutonic Knights on their crusading campaigns in Prussia in the late 1360s. This was the last battle in Europe's long history of fights for faith and glory. Now that his name is back, there is one thing that no one can explain. How did his body, unlike all the others around him, stay alive for 600 years? The science that froze decay. The last mystery became scientific once the man's name was known. Why hadn't his body broken down like every other person buried in the Middle Ages? After 600 years underground, he should have been made of bone dust. He stayed whole instead. The answer came from chemistry, the surroundings, and a strange relationship between time, metal, and water. The grave itself was the first hint. Lead can't breathe. Once the gaps are smashed together, air can't get in or out. Without oxygen, the bacteria that usually eat flesh go hungry, and the oxygen level drops to almost zero inside. There is instead a kind of microclimate that is damp, heavy, and slow. When water hits the inner walls, it mixes with human fat and natural oils to make a film that traps what's left. Something about the coffin's environment kept the body safe from the things that were meant to kill it. St. Bees's dirt did the rest. The ground around the priory stays cool and wet all year because it is close to the sea. Since the temperature doesn't change very often, enzymes that speed up decay only work slowly. Even the bacteria in the dirt move more slowly in that cold, oxygen-poor ground. Because the lead didn't let air in, the coastal environment worked like nature's fridge, keeping tissue alive that should have died hundreds of years ago. Adipocere, which is also known as grave wax, became a part of the mix over time. It forms when body fat breaks down in damp places with little oxygen. It turns into a pale, waxy material that sticks to organs and skin like soap. It does not always happen, but when it does, it can leave soft tissue stuck and protect it from air and more decay. In the St. Bees coffin, pieces of this wax stuck to the body, keeping details like fingernails, hair, and even signs of muscle tone that would have been lost otherwise. It was just as telling what the scientists didn't find. There were no resins, spices, or wax saturations found on the wrappings or tissue that showed they had been used for burial. The cloth shroud was plain and dry. Those things would have left marks if his family had tried to embalm him for the trip home. None showed up. So the protection wasn't a work of human genius. And that's the story of the knight who defied decay. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's mysteries, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, then click the next video popping up on your screen right now.